Welcome to DC Direct. I'm Lionel Donovan. Here in this show, we try to talk about some of the bigger stories, but we want to hear from you. So follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube at TRT World, and use the hashtag DC Direct to be a part of our conversation. On this show, we'll be talking about reparations and the American Descendants of Slave Movement, or ADOS.
America was founded on principles of liberty and freedom, and on the backs of slave labor.
People aren't starting out on the same base in terms of their ability to succeed. And so we have got to recognize that and give people a lift up.
I have long believed that this country should resolve its original sin of slavery, and that one of the ways we should consider doing that is through reparations.
I think we have to do everything that we can to end institutional racism in this country.
It is a cancer on the soul of our country and hurts the whole body politic, making us all less wealthy, making us all less just.
So reparations carries an emotional and psychological and even spiritual force.
Over the past few months, Democratic presidential candidates have hit the campaign trail with different proposals to stand out in a bid to secure votes ahead of the primaries. One proposal that has recently gained mainstream attention is for the government to find a way to address the country's legacy of slavery.
I want to say it's harder for them not to say anything. People have to say something, whether it's at the debate or at some point in their campaign. So I think that's a positive thing.
Although the U.S. is celebrating 243 years of freedom, the transatlantic slave trade remains a stain on the country's history, and its effects are being felt to this day. The practice was abolished in 1865 with the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which aimed to give former slaves full rights under U.S. law. There were also attempts to provide them with economic aid. So how did it turn out?
It had the immediate effect, at least, of increasing black land ownership. But that went away very quickly at the conclusion of Reconstruction. So once Andrew Johnson came in, he essentially returned those lands to their former white owners, and that effectively ended this very short project at black land ownership and trying to create black entrepreneurship, really.
How did this affect the black American community economically?
So once the federal government sort of retreats from this promise, we see black land ownership plummet in that very same period in these very same places. So economically, it was helpful initially, but that was over in a roughly 10-year period.
After decades of discriminatory housing and banking laws, the median wealth of a black household stood at just over $3,500 in 2016. For a white household, median wealth was nearly $147,000 in that same time frame. Simply calling on black Americans to work their way to closing the wealth gap doesn't seem to be an option either. From 2000 to 2018, median wages for white workers rose at a much faster rate than for black workers in every industry. So how can this historic injustice, which continues to have effects today, be remedied? Different solutions have been offered, but one that's been regularly suggested is reparations for the descendants of former slaves. And that's where the ADOS movement comes in.
The ADOS movement is a group of persons who seek to position African American people, black American people, who are descendants of American slaves, and out of that lineage, in a self-aware group that has a specific justice claim due to the inherited disadvantage of slavery, Jim Crow, convict leasing, mass incarceration, redlining, and finally, immigration. American descendants of slaves feel that reparations are the key policy prescription and remedy.
Amos Jones thinks that if the U.S. government had dealt with the country's newly freed slaves properly, the black American community would look much different than it does today from an economic standpoint. Instead, he feels discriminatory race-based laws and policies position black America as a permanent underclass, and something needs to be done about that now.
We're making that claim now because we're getting to a dire point here as of what we see on the horizon, a $70 trillion wealth transfer from baby boomers to their issue, we know that we're living a reflection wealth-wise of our grandparents. And if your grandparents were in a Jim Crow ghetto, which all black Americans were with few exceptions in this country due to those policies that we just discussed, then we're going to be in a world of trouble. And we will have nothing and be nothing, and we will never be able to climb out. And that's not fair because we built the country for free.
But should the solution lean so heavily on financial compensation? Dr. Carter thinks that the approach to reparations should be more comprehensive.
Right, we're essentially trying to fix something that was broken. And there are a number of ways to approach that. And when you're talking about the African American communities, this can happen on a number of dimensions. And that doesn't necessarily mean every individual person who is black gets some amount of money. Because when we monetize it, and you do that, so take money in exchange for your pain, that transaction essentially says that we are done here. Right? Legally, I have fixed you, and therefore, I don't want to hear anything else about it. And I think what we're talking about when we're thinking about reparations is the more holistic picture, and that is not going to be fixed with one check.
But whatever the solution may be, or the form reparations take, Catherine feels it's important to make sure that those solutions are targeted specifically to the community that suffered.
I think they do a good job outlining this also, like in their research, the idea that the influx of black migrants happened during like really catastrophic times for the black community. And the idea that even when you think about kind of the model minority status that we see in other African adjacent, it's not quite parallel because of course you are black in America, but the idea that that didn't really aid in the blacks in America kind of being able to be compensated for what happened. So I think that the distinction, the idea of being in America by choice is very different than being here by an act of displacement. And I think that that is a really important line. And it's not, you know, anything anti our diasporic brothers and sisters, but just understanding that this is a debt that has not been paid specifically to the people here.
While the U.S. celebrates its independence and freedoms during July 4th, many people in the country still remember when their ancestors were in chains and are calling for something to remedy that historical injustice. The call for reparations is growing louder. So how will the country respond and address the sins of its past? Well, that's all the time we have today in DC Direct, but please follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube at TRT World, and use the hashtag DC Direct to let us know what you think about reparations. Does the U.S. still owe a debt to its African American community, or is it too late? Until next time, I'm Lionel Donovan.